carrier was a vital weapon in World War II. This versatile ship delivered replacement fighter planes to larger carriers and performed anti-submarine raids.
By the end of the war, 24 Essex-class carriers had been produced. These ships came online from December 1942, with 7 being commissioned by the end of the following year. With the new ships came new sailors. The expansion of the Navy had spread its seasoned resources thinly. From the moment the crew came on board a new ship, the shakedown was intense. Each man had to be sure of his duties, practiced and skilled. When they passed through the Panama Canal into the Pacific, there was no time for an extended familiarization. From the dockyard, the ship went fairly directly to the war zone. With over 3,400 men on board, each ship was like a small town. On board were the specialist services of a town: butchers, plumbers, bakers, doctors, carpenters, and so on. The flyers were, of course, the striking arm of the ship, and considerable glamour attached to them. The Essex-class carried between 80 and 100 planes, and this strength relied on the multitude of specialists, running the ship and her defenses and maintaining and arming the planes. There was little leisure time on the cruise to war. A Navy pilot once remarked that the ship looks like a matchstick in a swimming pool when you're coming into land. The Essex carriers were very big as ships, but as airfields, their flight decks were tiny. The management of the limited space on a carrier is one of the most significant, complex, and continuous activities on board. Space, or rather the lack of it, is critical. Onto this small and crowded airfield returned planes that were often damaged, limping home with their crew. Sometimes unable to land, they were forced to just crash. Where land bases were surrounded by wrecks that were picked over for parts by mechanics, there was no room for such luxury on a ship. If a plane was badly damaged, that was it. If available, another would be lifted out of the hold and assembled. But in any case, a wrecked plane was only a waste of space. Though crew losses remained surprisingly low for much of the war, attrition of planes was another matter. While the U.S. Navy repeatedly extended itself to minimize casualties, the demands for new crew to man new ships and to relieve and replace the men in the front line saw over 30,000 Navy pilots in training by the end of 1942. The Japanese Navy, in contrast, reached its peak of strength with 3,500 experienced flyers in 1941 and was unable to match either the numbers or the quality of the American pilots. Life for the deck crew was irregularly punctuated with moments of high drama and danger. A phosphorus fire in a bomb strapped to a plane, for example. The special cases produced by combat were added to the normal number of accidents. Planes overrunning or missing the wires and ending up in the barrier, or a plane getting a blowout on landing. All all the crew could do was ensure that the plane was in the best possible condition when the pilot got into it, that the guns would work, that the bombs were safely stowed, that the engine would run sweetly, that the plane was clean to extract the last edge of speed that might make a critical difference. And if he could get it back to the ship in any condition, then the crew would do anything possible to ensure he got out safely. The pilots understood their reliance on the shipboard specialists in very simple terms. Every time he took off, the pilot put his life in their hands.
The enlisted man, whether he's the man in your squadron or whether he's a shipboard deck handler, the man that unhooks your tail hook, the man that catapults you, or the man that moves you between planes. I trusted the man that put that aircraft under me, and I think that's a supreme compliment you can pay somebody.
My plane captain was 19 years old, 18 years old, Sammy Belt from the Essex. And I just have to ask him, is the plane ready to fly?
Wartime experience was underlining the importance of the aircraft carrier, but was also demonstrating that the powerful attack carrier was either wasted or inappropriate in many situations where some sort of carrier was needed. Different demands were being made for a great number of carriers, but clearly it would not be necessary or affordable to build a huge fleet of Essex-class ships. One need was that of fast fleet defense. What was needed here was a ship with the speed of an attack carrier, but needing only to carry fighters. Cruiser hulls were selected for conversion, but not the huge battle cruisers that had become Saratoga and Lexington. Flimsy speedsters, Cleveland-class light cruiser hulls, were transformed into what became the Independence-class carriers. With an aerial complement of 45 planes and a speed of 31 knots, they provided a strong protective umbrella for the battle fleet and the big carriers, who were able to send off their own fighters to cover the attack planes. Compared to the 27,000-ton Essex ships, the Independence displaced only 11,000 tons. They did serve well in their niche. All 9 were commissioned in 1943, and they served for many years.
Don't go away. Carriers will be back in a moment.
Invention, Tuesdays at 9 Eastern, only on the Discovery Channel.
To achieve your ultimate potential, we introduce the Nordic Flex Gold, the breakthrough in strength training technology that makes all other machines obsolete, including SoloFlex. Nordic Flex Gold is 5 ways better than SoloFlex. Nordic Flex Gold simulates the linear motion of free weights, maximizing your workout. In contrast, SoloFlex uses a less effective arcing motion, which can pull your body out of the correct workout position. Nordic Flex Gold has isokinetic resistance to match your natural strength curve. Your body is stronger at certain points of the stroke and weaker at others. The isokinetic resistance of Nordic Flex Gold accommodates these differences, supplying the most resistance when you are strongest and the least when you are weakest. So you get maximum resistance throughout the entire range of motion and maximum results. On a SoloFlex, the resistance simply increases as the rubber band stretches. It does not match your natural strength curve, so your workout is less efficient. Nordic Flex Gold's isokinetic resistance also gives you speed and convenience. You quickly move between exercises without changing steel plates or rubber bands. With Nordic Flex Gold, changeover between exercises is up to 40% faster than SoloFlex. Only Nordic Flex Gold has an electronic feedback system to tell you the number of reps and how much weight you've lifted. With SoloFlex, an electronic performance monitor is simply not available. And Nordic Flex Gold is a better value. Nordic Flex Gold costs only $999 complete. A SoloFlex costs $1,000, and to get the leg and butterfly attachments costs you an extra $500. Nordic Flex Gold, a better workout, faster and more effective for 1/3 less money. The comparison is clear, the choice is obvious. Call now to order your Nordic Flex Gold, the ultimate strength training machine for the ultimate body.
Above a ring of fire, open and exposed, into danger, and over the burning heart. Go into the volcano on a search for knowledge, a search for adventure. Tuesday at 10 Eastern, only on the Discovery Channel.
And now, back to carriers.
Carriers were also needed in great numbers for a range of humbler but no less critical roles. Remote islands needed new planes delivered. Assault craft ferrying men to the beach needed to be kept free of air attack. Convoys needed fighter protection against submarines and long-range bombers. Obviously, a carrier plodding along with a convoy did not need to be able to do 30 knots or deploy 100 planes. But equally as obvious, there were a lot of convoys.
For one long period, we were losing over 500,000 tons of ships per month. Altogether, we lost several thousand ships. The shore-based airplanes we had early in the war were not long enough range to reach all the way across the Atlantic. And so there was a so-called mid-ocean gap. Our CVEs came along and closed that gap up. When they did, the CVEs really made a shambles of the subfleet.
In the course of the war, the U.S. Navy commissioned over 80 escort carriers. More were built for the British and other navies. Despite being known as baby flat tops or jeep carriers, these ships made an immense contribution wherever they were deployed. The first were converted merchantmen, but soon hulls were being built as escort carriers, still basically to freighter designs, but urgently needed to carry planes. There were 7 different classes of U.S. escort carriers, but all tended to be around 8,000 tons, restricted to under 20 knots in speed, and deploying around 30 aircraft. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the 2 carriers based there were both engaged in one type of activity, ferrying planes. Lexington was over 1,200 miles away delivering dive bombers to the Marines on Midway, and Enterprise was returning from a similar mission to take 12 Wildcats to Wake. These ferrying missions had the fortuitous effect of keeping the carriers from the cauldron at Pearl Harbor. But from the moment the war started, any use of a fleet carrier as an airplane transport was a waste of all that ship's power. The escort carriers in the Pacific spent a lot of time carting aircraft to various islands. The distances involved were way outside the range of most of the planes, and the only way to shorten those distances were to move the airfield nearer, use a carrier, or disassemble the plane and put it on a ship to be reassembled before use. The latter was, of course, impractical in the battlefield, and the arrival of functioning airplanes under their own power was far preferable. Here, as the convoys prepare to set sail for the invasion of the Marianas, squadrons of Air Force P-47 Thunderbolts are loaded onto 2 of the Casablanca-class carriers. The invasion of Saipan would see some of the bloodiest fighting of the war, dragging on over 3 weeks to secure an island of only 72 square miles. The air cover and air support for the troops would have to be initially provided by the fleet carriers. But to tie them to a beachhead not only robbed them of their lethal maneuverability in attack, but also made them relatively static targets. It was essential that planes be deployed from the island air bases as soon as possible after the invasion, which is where the P-47s on the 2 escort carriers came in. They were to be flown to Saipan as soon as the airfield there could be captured and readied for use, and by doing so, release the fleet carriers to go about more appropriate duties. In later invasions, groups of escort carriers would provide the air cover for the beachhead themselves. The expansion of American carrier strength is startling. In 1941, the fleet boasted a strength of 7 carriers, 6 fleet carriers and 1 fairly experimental escort carrier. 3 years later, in 1944, the fleet composed 13 fleet carriers, the 9 Independence-class light fleet carriers, and 63 escort carriers. The total of 85 carriers does not reflect a strength of 85 Essex-class carriers. However, the presence of the escort carriers does mean that the 22 fast fleet carriers could all be available to act in attacking formations. The situation otherwise would have seen the power of the fleet divided into active and passive roles. The escort carriers had the effect of multiplying the force available for offensive action, cheaply and very quickly. The escort carriers were basically unarmored, built upon standard hulls. They were also slow. When the kamikazes entered the conflict, they were often attracted by these slow-moving, less defended, and flimsily constructed ships. The little carriers suffered badly when hit. No Essex-class ship was to be sunk during the war, though some received terrible damage. For their tiny relatives, things went far harder. One theater that the escort carriers came to dominate was the Atlantic, where they became a key player in the war against the German Navy's submarine force. In a battle that was fought as hard and as closely as any engagement of the conflict, the fighting in the Atlantic seesawed over the course of the war, with the U-boat seeming to have gained the upper hand for several periods.
Don't go away. Carriers will return in a moment.
Beyond Tomorrow, Tuesdays at 9:30 Eastern, only on the Discovery Channel.
At GMC Truck, we've seen days like this for over 80 years. And have learned the value of a van that gives you the most room in its class. The added safety of 4-wheel anti-lock brakes. The traction of full-time all-wheel drive. And the feeling of security that can only come from a van that's built as strong as a truck. Safari from GMC Truck. More proof of the strength of experience.
Honey, I wonder if you could tell me where this is.
Oh, dancing and music. It's definitely a party town.
Is it Rio?
Oh, yes, Brazil.
No. No. Look, this is a place for excitement, adventure.
Yes, nature, wilderness.
Is there a jungle?
Yes.
Oh, we'll take the kids.
Africa. Yes.
Well, okay, well, we know for sure it's the Mediterranean.
Yeah, nice.
No.
This year, discover the new old world. Puerto Rico.
We'll be there.
Ever notice how sharks never stop moving? Swim here, swim there. That never-ending search for, well, whatever it is sharks search for. People are like that. We search for knowledge, for answers. It's that constant need to know. Well, in this search, we have one big advantage over sharks. We can watch the Learning Channel. We can pick up the phone, dial 1-800-443-1212, and find out if we already have the Learning Channel. And if we don't, who to talk to get TLC. Big advantage, fingers over fins. Besides, you never hear a shark tell a cable company, thanks for the TLC.
There are a lot of smart reasons to apply for the American Express card. Just call us at 1-800-THE-CARD.
And then a canceled flight won't leave you stranded.
I can't believe they canceled our flight.
It'll be fine. This is a great day. It's a beautiful drive.
Because unlike a bank card, the American Express card has no preset spending limit.
You can apply right over the phone.
With the American Express card, you're in control. You pay your bill in full. There's no revolving debt, no outrageous interest. You stay out of that trap.
So call 1-800-THE-CARD. You can apply right over the phone.
I still don't know where I lost that wallet. My whole life was in it. Pictures, license.
So we're on bread and water?
Oh, no. New card.
If you ever lose the card or it's stolen, you can get a replacement in 24 hours.
Don't delay. Call 1-800-THE-CARD and apply now.
And now we return to carriers.
The introduction of the escort carriers had immediately served to curtail the activity of the long-range Luftwaffe Condors, which had been attacking convoys well out of the range of protective fighters based in the British Isles. The Condors had been very effective in their bombing and strafing attacks and had supplemented the work of the German main guard, the subs. The overcoming of the submarines was to take considerably longer. As the escort carriers first came onto the scene, they operated as their name implies, escorting convoys, physically trudging across the ocean in company with the group of freighters and keeping an umbrella of air power open. In this passive role, they suppressed the activity of the long-range bombers very efficiently and did cause major difficulties for the subs, which were forced to spend a lot more time submerged. At that time, the major offensive against the submarines was being taken up by hunter-killer groups of destroyers and frigates. Later, as their numbers multiplied, the escort carriers became the core of a new kind of hunter-killer group, a circle of destroyers acting in concert with a baby flat top. The combination of planes with the fast and deadly destroyers was to be the final straw for the submarine offensive. Now, no matter where they were deployed to, in wolf packs or alone, they were constantly subject to interruption and attack from the air. And when the carrier planes appeared, the U-boat crew knew that the destroyers were not far away. In the right conditions, the thin, distinctive shape of the submarine could be easily seen from the air up to a depth of 60 feet, and the subs began to spend less and less time near the surface. Given the huge difference in the speed of a U-boat on the surface as opposed to one submerged, the carriers were radically curtailing the subs' mobility and effectiveness, even when they didn't find and sink them. The Casablanca-class carrier Guadalcanal was at the center of a hunter-killer group that pulled off one of the more dramatic escapades of the war during a patrol in the Atlantic in May 1944. The group made contact with a submarine, and with the aircraft keeping it under visual surveillance, the destroyers proceeded to give it a hammering with depth charges. When the submarine surfaced, the American ships had opened fire only with their lighter guns, but the German crew had no intention of fighting. They opened the scuttles to sink their boat and took to the sea. The Americans had already launched boarding parties, and they took possession of the submarine in time to shut the seacocks and stop her from sinking. However, they were unable to operate the ship's pumps to clear the water out, and the U-505 remained full of water and very near to going down. U-505 wallowed uncomfortably in the Atlantic swell as more men from the carrier boarded her. Having captured a submarine, the last thing they wanted was to have it sink on them, but it was to prove a difficult matter to bring the reluctant sub under control. While this effort to save their U-boat was going on, the German crew were picked up by other ships in the group. In the critical months of the Battle of the Atlantic, the few available escort carriers had been tied to the convoys. But as their numbers had allowed their release to active anti-sub patrol rather than convoy defense, their success was striking. In the 12 months from May 1943, their planes sank 43 submarines. A very valuable contribution in itself, but more importantly, with their ferocious supplement to the long-range liberators, the Battle of the Atlantic had been won. While the fleet carriers were to remain in commission for many years after the end of the war, most of the escort carriers were discarded at war's end. Some of the most basic carriers had simply been decked merchantmen, deploying only 4 planes, still traveling with holds full of cargo. These could easily be returned to more conventional configuration and resume their merchant activity. Many of the purpose-built carriers required more refitting than they were worth in the post-war glut of shipping. Most disappeared almost as fast as they had arrived. Guadalcanal, the carrier which captured the U-boat, was scrapped in 1956, a fate which her prize eluded. The submarine is preserved and displayed at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. Though it was a close call, U-505 had been taken under tow by the carrier and had been dragged along behind as the ship steamed to a rendezvous with an ocean-going tug, still flying off her patrols. Guadalcanal's coup in capturing U-505 and taking it under control as a war prize is a footnote in history, almost a sideshow. Much of the work of the little carriers was like that. Beside the well-known feats of the task groups which fought epic battles over hundreds of miles of ocean, the escort carriers were nearly invisible. Despite the lack of glamour, however, their contribution was enormous. The work they did was essential, and the work they did was very well done.
Coming up, combat from the soldier's point of view. Through first-hand accounts, you'll experience the ordeal of combat in World War II, the hardship, the terror. Stay with us for GI Diary, next on the Discovery Channel.